But I'd like to introduce Joe, K6 SAT. Got that right? Okay, good. So Joe has a master's in computer engineering, specialized in space communications. He did that for 30 years. And he's going to talk to us tonight about the Western States Endurance Run. But I think you're going to overlap onto why it's important to have amateur radio at all these type of events, not just this particular run. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe. Thank you, Joe.
So K6 SAT, I'm going to talk about Western States and a little bit about the importance of amateur radio. I think I did this a couple of years ago, and there's been a lot of changes over the last few years. So hopefully I'll give you an idea of some of the improvements that we've made. So start off with Western States is the world's oldest endurance run, the first one before it became popular. Still running today, as is Tevis, which was what Western States was born out of, was Tevis. So Olympic Valley is where it all starts, and it's all downhill from there. And you'll quickly see it's not downhill, but you're going downhill, but you're also going up and down. Anyway, it finishes at the track in Auburn at the Placer High School. So 18,000 feet of elevation gain, and then of course you go down about 23,000. That's not a overly difficult run in terms of ultra running, but it is still a lot of elevation and requires a lot of training to be able to do that. Western States is not the hardest ultra race out there, but it is the oldest and the most respected out there. So each year we have about 369 runners, and you may ask, well, why is it 369? There are certain restrictions in certain areas of the trail where we're only allowed to have a certain number of runners, as is Tevis, a certain number of riders and horses. And that number is 369, and that was a number that we used in last year. This year, we're able to go up to 385, and the reasoning for that was last year was the year after COVID, and we did not have 369 runners. So we need to have an average of 369. And so the 385 gets us back on track. And the year after that, you'll see it'll go back to 369. So 1,600 volunteers. Think about that. That's a lot of people. That's really what makes this race successful. If you're a runner, the volunteers help you get from Squaw to Auburn, and runners need a lot of hand-holding sometimes, and volunteers not only providing safety, but emotional guidance sometimes is needed, to get these runners where they need to go. So 23 different aid stations. It's a point-to-point course. I'll show you on the map here in a second. And then we have a net control, which is a small building where we have communications, we have internet, runner tracking, and race management. Some of you have probably worked net control in the past and so are familiar with that. We have about 80 radio volunteers, so licensed amateur radio operators, which is a lot. And that's the aid stations, that's net control, and that's also sweeps. And sweeps are runners with radios, and they each do maybe 15 to 20 miles of the course as a group, and they're looking for runners that maybe are at the back of the pack, maybe having problems, or maybe a runner with a medical condition. And they have radios, so they can call into net control, and we can get them assistance if they need it. So June 25th, 26th, this is the Other Field Day. You've heard about the other one. Every once in a while, Western States and Field Day are on different weekends. It happens every once in a while. I've not figured out what the equation is, but so a little bit about the time. It's 30 hours. Tevis is 24 hours, so 30 hours for runners. So the fastest time is 14 hours and 9 minutes, which is incredibly fast. You can calculate the mile pace. It's very impressive. Female, 16 hours and 47. I happened to have run this race last year, and I was 26 hours. So I'm not overly slow. These people are really good athletes. Anyway, a couple links here. I'm sure the presentation will be made available. If you're interested, you can go check that out. My Western States email address is radio@wser.org, and my phone number is there. So a little bit about, before I get into some specifics. So it starts at Olympic Valley, and it involves a river crossing. And depending upon the flow, which varies, and the level, you may be going across in a boat. You may be going across under your own power using a cable. You may be wearing a life jacket or not. It all has to do with the flow of the river and the height of it. Now, whatever it's going to be during the day, every runner gets subjected to it. So if there was no water, you'd still have to have a life jacket on if you had to have a life jacket earlier in the day. It's just to be fair. The lower left-hand corner is me finishing last year. I took the liberty of including my finish in there. That's my daughter who paced me the last 20 miles next to me there. So temperatures, they advertise freezing, right? You can get snow, you can get hail, and we've had that, and it can be very hot. The numbers that are shown here, 50 degrees and 104, that's as measured in Auburn, right? So it could be much colder. If it's 50 degrees here, it's probably a bit cooler up high on the course. It was 101 last year, so about 104 is the record. So this is the course. On the upper right is Olympic Valley, and then these are all the aid stations, made up of a lot of canyons, which I'll show you in the next picture, all the way down to Placer High School. This gives you a little bit better view of it. So now you can begin to see the elevation, the ups and downs over the miles. You can also see where some of the major canyons are. And I don't know if my mouse is working, so I'm just going to walk over here. So Duncan Canyon, right here, that's one of our crossband repeaters. We also have a crossband repeater here in El Dorado Canyon and Deadwood Canyon. So we have 3 crossband repeaters, and that's essentially to enable someone with a handheld anywhere in that canyon to be able to talk back to net control. And so we'll talk a little bit about the technology that we use, the crossband repeaters, but this gives you an idea of I'm running down into a canyon and I've got to get back up the other side, and this is just one of many. So this is one reason why the race is so hard. It's not just 18,000 feet of climbing, it's over and over, up and down. So some of the technology, I mentioned the crossband repeaters. We get essentially pretty crystal clear coverage if you're line of sight to our antenna. Now, think about a runner with a handheld. You know, they've got a pack, they've got their handheld in here, they may have a long antenna, but maybe it's wrapped around their back. They've got an external mic. Really hard to understand them sometimes. Sometimes it's a poor signal. These are runners with radios. These are not radio operators that run. So the idea of having your HT and maybe holding it out here, maybe with the antenna out there, that doesn't come naturally to some of these runners that have radios. We do have some radio operators that run a little bit, and that's helpful because they're more skilled at using the radios. We do training. Training runs are not only for runners, but they're also for radio people and sweeps so that they can learn how to use their radios effectively. So 40 to 45 sweep runners, 22 of those are licensed. So you can be a sweep but not have a radio. You're obviously not talking on the radio, but you have a radio person with you that can essentially get you in communication to whatever you need. So WinLink, if you're familiar with that, it's essentially the ability to send an email over the radio at the blazing speed of 1200 baud, which is still pretty fast compared to doing it by voice, which is really what that replaced in many cases. We have about 10 aid stations that use WinLink, and in addition to it being a little bit faster, it's gotten rid of the errors for the most part. So a runner goes by, you write down the bib number and the time, and you do that for 369 runners. You put them on a sheet, you hand them to the radio person transmits that over the air. person at net control puts it down on another piece of paper, then hands it to a tracking team. So an error could have occurred at any point in there. So WinLink gets rid of half of that and reduces the errors significantly. Very important that we know where runners are, and it's a safety thing. It's also visibility to their crews, so their crews are at the right place at the right time to give them aid. So we have people who contribute to the infrastructure. Ken, NB6S, he has a digipeater as well as a crossband repeater that he deploys up on Little Bald Mountain, the old Duncan lookout, if you're familiar with it, above Robinson Flat. And that gives us the crossband W up there. It also gives us a digipeater, so if you're running WinLink and you're at Dusty Corners or some other location, you don't need to get to Mount Vaca or some way far away system that degrades when it gets hot. Instead, it's just a few mile hop and we get into a local gateway. So that's really improved things quite a bit. We also maintain a gateway in Michigan Bluff, which many of the aid stations that use WinLink can get to. And that's up 24/7. That's a public gateway that's available if anyone's interested in using that. We also deploy Raspberry Pis. We would deploy more, but they're really expensive right now, as I'm sure many of you know. I'm kidding a little bit, but we put Raspberry Pis, we give them to some of the aid stations, and we create a Wi-Fi link. And so even though there's no internet, we transmit the runner database over WinLink so that with your phone, you can access a semi-static database of runners and where they're at. So if you're a crew and you're waiting at the river, Rucky Chucky, you're waiting for your runner and you're wondering where they are, you can look at this, even though there's no internet down there most of the time, and see where they're at. So this is helps the crews, volunteers to know where the runners are. And that's all done over the radio. We also have KM6 LYW. He has an RPI set up with WinLink on race day. It's set up on WinLink. Otherwise, I think it's an APRS system up at the Georgetown Airport. Absolutely phenomenal location. Just wonderful. It's everyone's favorite gateway now. So it gets a lot of use. So voice is imperative. Voice is never going to go away. It means so much to hear someone explain something rather than just put it into an email and send it off. It's also quicker when you have an emergency. So every single aid station and checkpoint has radio. In some cases, they're there for 18 hours providing radio support. Multiple teams sometimes are deployed, multiple shifts since they're there so long. We also use timing mats, so when a runner gets a bib, it has an RFID chip in it. It may have a couple of them in there because we use a couple different systems. So they run across the mat, it captures their time and their bib number. We have RFID wands, so a little handheld device that kind of swipe your runner as they go by. That uses cell service, that uses satellite. These are deployed at strategic areas where runners are close together. Otherwise, it's humans writing down the numbers and radio to get the results back to net control. So we use seven different repeaters to make this happen. One of the most important repeaters is W6EK. It works equally well up high on the course as well as down low on the course. It's oversubscribed sometimes on race day, and so we have to move people around depending upon activity levels. But W6EK repeater is phenomenal. We typically use the 70 centimeter in analog mode to get into it such that it's linked to 2 meters, so we can reduce how many 2-meter transmitters we have at net control. Helps reduce interference. We use 23 centimeters to link into Bald Mountain, again, to reduce 2-meter transmissions. And then we use 70 centimeters to get into Squaw Peak. There's a repeater up there that we use to essentially get access to the ski resort area down below when the runners are first coming up. And all this also for Tevis as well. And then more recently, we have LTE microwave link. When I said Rucky Chucky didn't have internet, well, it kind of has internet now because we have a microwave link, and that basically speeds up the numbers. It also helps with the crews knowing where their runners are. And then this year we're deploying Starlink. So we have a couple of portable Starlinks. Once they enabled RV use, this counts, so we're trying that out. A lot of it may be used for video, for media, but can also be used for, by the way, my timer stopped, so I don't know where I am time-wise, but okay, importance of amateur radio, and this is really one of the big things that I wanted to talk about. So a lot of things happen, over 30 plus hours with all kinds of things. There could be fires, there could be law enforcement issues going on, there can be vandalism, there could be, people with vehicles in areas that they shouldn't have vehicles in. So there's a lot of operational awareness going on with the various agencies. These agencies also know where we're at. They stop by. We communicate what's going on so that we're aware and they're aware. The most important thing is medical emergencies, and I'm going to go through this list a little bit, but before I get to it, 4 to 6 runners each year end up in the hospital, either during the race or immediately after the race. It's just part of the thing. Western states is really hard to get into. It's so hard to get into. When you get into it, you show up and you do your best, even if you're not ready. And it just may not be your day. It's too hot. You didn't have the proper training. Your body will support you until it can no longer support you. And that's where the medical emergencies come into play. We've had heart attacks, not from runners, but from volunteers. It's hot out there, and you need to take care of yourself. Heat stroke is pretty common with respect to runners. Dehydration, kind of obvious, right? You need to drink more. But runners sometimes take that to the extreme. They drink too much. When you drink too much, you get low sodium, and that turns into hypernatremia. And that has symptoms that looks like dehydration. So in the past, you would just get more water. It just makes the situation worse. This now is an understood, situation that our medical staff at all the aid stations can recognize, and so that's not been too much of a problem, but you can still run into that. People can take salt tablets, right, to have enough sodium, and they can take too much, and so you get sodium poisoning. You can have people fall. There's several areas that are very rocky on the course. You're trying to run fast, it's downhill. I can do 7-minute miles, 8-minute miles. It's sharp rock. And we've had people fall in between Cal 1, which is one of the first aid stations outside of Forest Hill, and Cal 2, which is where Greg is this year, along with Orion. And people fall, and they basically hit their head, and they have a big gash, and it's bleeding. Now, one of the things Western States doesn't do is we'll evaluate somebody if they're having problems and suggest maybe that they don't continue, even if they need stitches, okay? So we had someone come through Cal 2 a couple of years ago, 2019, they fell, they needed stitches. The medical facility said, I think you can continue, we'll take care of the stitches at the end. And they made it. They finished, they got their stitches, everything was fine. So we don't pull the ripcord right away. With that said, we had a really interesting incident that was, could have been very tragic, and I just want to make a point of it because the communications is the reason why the person is still running today. They came into Cal 2, and their legs hurt. Well, everyone's leg hurts on a 100-mile run. They took some Advil, and they tried swallowing it. Well, they tore their esophagus, and it impacted their breathing to the point where they had one lung collapse. And we got the call on the radio. We called emergency services. We gave them the GPS location of the cul-de-sac above the aid station. They were there in less than 10 minutes. They brought the runner up, got him into the hospital, and he was in the hospital for 6 weeks, and he's fine. He's running this year at Western States. So that was an example where, if we didn't have radio there, Greg said to me tonight, he goes, I had a little bit of a signal on my cell phone. Well, yeah, things are getting better, but could you imagine trying to call emergency services on your phone with 1 bar? Anyway, so other things, loss of vision, heat stroke, you could have loss of vision as an example of something from that. This is really why radio is at Western States, is really to prevent these things from turning into worse situations. Another thing, fire seasons, smoke. It's possible we have to evacuate the course, and it's a real concern. And so we have evacuation routes fully documented for every aid station, how to get people out, how to close the course off, how to get runners evacuated. Communications is essential to that. Now, on a little bit lighter note, so this is Michigan Bluff. This is an example of what used to be there. Yeah. So, hey, runners have to pee now and then. It's not a good sign if you're not. If you are, the color is important. And we've had medical calls about runners that were concerned about the color of their pee because of dehydration. And, so it's an important thing. We have medical people at every aid station, and that really helps with consoling runners who are concerned. Sometimes the runner decides to stop running, and sometimes they continue and they're fine, and maybe they drop at the next aid station. Okay, a little bit of what goes on. So this is one of the aid stations at Lion Ridge. It's kind of the first aid station after you go up over the escarpment. So Dave, KC6YFG, is one of our operators that's been there for 20 plus years. He takes communications really seriously. We've never had a situation where we didn't get numbers from him. And we've had all kinds of problems. And one year he was sending it via HF, and we still got it, WinLink via HF. So very resourceful. He's done crossband repeaters for us, all kinds of things. This is me, long time ago at Duncan Canyon. It's kind of a camping thing, right? You pull up, you set up your tent, your battery-powered whatever, and you're there for a day or two, depending on your shift. Robinson Flat in 2019, this is a really big aid station, so we have a lot of radio volunteers. You can recognize a few people in there, Ken Krause and Bruce, K6BAA. These are doing numbers tracking, controlling crossband repeaters, digipeaters that are up on the Little Bald Mountain lookout, handling issues with parking that are down at Sailor Flat. So lots of things going on at these aid stations. 2021, this is the Robinson. You can see there's a few people that are there every year. Bruce is one of those. Ken is one of those. We have hams from out of the area. You may not recognize some of the call signs, W6ASB, W6CRB. They're from the Bay Area. They come up every year and volunteer. And Dusty Corners, KS6M. This is John. He's been at that aid station for a long time and does WinLink, very, very reliable in getting his signal out. Last Chance, this is before you drop into Devil's Thumb, Deadwood Canyon. Really hard to get out WinLink a long time ago when we didn't have the temporary digipeater set up on the lookout, because you were going all the way to Mount Vaca. And in the afternoon, it heats up, doesn't work anymore. Now we fixed that. We've got the station up that's just a few miles line of sight, so it works very well. Forest Hill, a Yagi is not needed, but you can deploy whatever you want, and that's what people do. So Forest Hill is usually talking to Forest Hill repeater, works with an HT. Cal 1, this is a very small aid station. You just use a handheld. Sometimes we have a Diamond X50 up in the side of the tent. Sometimes a handheld works across the canyon, no problem. Cal 2, so this is 2019. You can see Brian and Orion, 2019. Last year, 2021. So Greg joined the team along with Orion, and same team this year. So it'll be a similar setup. I came through there, and it was quite fun last year when I came through there to see Orion and Greg. But they do dinner, potluck, and stuff, so it's quite nice. Cal 3, that's the last aid station before you get to the river, and It's not a great big place, but it's much appreciated. You've basically got 3 miles to the river after you hit this aid station. And finally, at the river, it's a big setup: microwave link, wind link, voice, runner tracking, river crossing, parking shuttles, all kinds of stuff going on. Really great team. We have a great person who comes up from the Bay Area who leads this site, and then we have a variety of different runners that are radio operators that join him. And then Auburn Lakes Trail, he's from out of the area, but and this year we'll have someone else there. He's, I think, retired or not able to make it this year. And then a little bit on crossband repeaters. So this is a temporary one that we set up on Little Bald Mountain, crossband repeater and the KA node. Okay, so crossbands. So this on the left is a Husky toolbox with rollers, painted white so it doesn't heat up as much as it would if it was black. There's a fan, a thermostat control, and there's a 100 amp hour battery in there. A Kenwood V71A in crossband mode with a serial number that is early enough that you can still use DTMF to control it remotely. I can turn this on and off from many places along the course. I don't need to be at this site. But we do have people that are nearby these sites should the problems arise. Last year we had these things basically lock up. We had to shut them all down. And unfortunately, I was running, so I had no idea what was going on. This year we've relocated these so that a person is within, running distance to get to them. Anyways, this is how we make them. There's, a little battery gauge to tell you how much power you've got left, what the temperature is inside. They work really well, and we deploy 3 of these. This is an example of one deployment that we did over Memorial Day training runs. So you can see it just sitting out there, all self-contained, and then we use military-style mast system, all guided off, and 1 antenna. We used to run a Yagi and a vertical to separate the 70 centimeters from the 2 meters, and really not necessary. We're getting the same performance that we would otherwise. And then lastly, back at net control, this is that air-conditioned building with snacks and beverages. It's I say that because I need one more person if you're interested. But no, it's race management is in there, which is usually 1 or 2 people, and then the ultralive team, which is 3 to 4 people, and then the radio team, which is 5 or 6 people. There's essentially 5 radios, 1 operator for a couple radios. We can have up to 4 operators at a time. You can see some of our antennas there, the 23 centimeter Yagi and the 70 centimeter Yagi, both pointing either to Squaw or to Bald Mountain. And then there's one of the verticals there. Now, Brian came by last time because we needed some sort of a connector or adapter that we needed, and he drove it down there, and he just looked at the antenna vertical separation and said, that could be improved. Yes, it can. And not in the budget this year, but we need to increase the vertical separation of our antennas. I keep mentioning we use 70 centimeters and 23 centimeters to avoid interference, and that interference is due to how close the antennas are. But we work with the space that we have. So that's all I have prepared. If there's time and any questions, I'm happy to attempt to answer them. Yes?
So I noticed on there you talked about sweeps. So what are sweeps?
Sweeps are runners that happen to be licensed ham operators, and they run a portion of the course behind the runners in case they run across runners at the back of the pack that are having problems, and they're used as a final gate to all runners have been through this aid station. No one's left behind. In addition to the tracking, we use people to ensure that there's no stragglers, and that these people also pull all the flaggings from the course markings. So we usually have teams of 5 or 6, and usually there's 2 radio operators per team, and there's usually 6 to 7 teams for the entire run.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I've got a silly question. What happens, you said your time was 26 hours, is that right? What happens if you got to do number 2?
It's a fair question. It's a fair question. Yeah, so at the aid stations, there are porta potties.
Okay.
Most people probably can't wait to get to the next aid station, and so they're basically told to follow U.S. Forest Service recommendations on burying waste and such. But yeah, it happens. There's not a lot of privacy as a runner when things happen. So, any other questions? All right, thank you very much.